Good afternoon. On behalf of the Cutchogue, New Suffolk Historical Council and Museums and the Cutchogue, New Suffolk Free Library, I would like to welcome you to our historic performance of Loyalist versus Patriot, the Great Debate, a debate between Loyalist Parker Wickham and Patriot Jared Landon. The Cutchogue, New Suffolk Historical Council and Museums owns and operates the Village Green, making it available to the community for its use, and we maintain and interpret the 6 historic house museums on the Green, including the Old House. We offer tours of the buildings, and we keep the Green busy with activities and offer it for use to other nonprofits. We also own and maintain the Cutchogue Old Burying Ground, and I am the Executive Director, Mark McNish. But today, I will be acting as the moderator of this debate. I would also like to introduce Stuart Whalen as Parker Wickham.
I'm a Patriot, woo!
And Richard Gardini as Jared Landon. The script we are using for the debate is a result of months of research. In many cases, it uses Wickham and Landon's own words, taken from their extant letters, manuscripts, and writings. They will be referencing actual historical events. Some of their attitudes and opinions are implied by their actions and align with those of philosophical views held by their counterparts and respective sides of the day. Before we begin the debate, I would like to set the stage for what Southold was like leading up to and during the Revolutionary War. The French and Indian War was a precursor of the Revolution. Many colonists joined British troops in the fighting, and 150 men from Southold fought in the decisive, victorious battle at Fort Ticonderoga towards the end of the war. During their lifetime, alongside the British, colonial soldiers were treated with disdain and contempt and were viewed as inferior to British soldiers and officers. They saw them as undisciplined and unprofessional. They often forced them into supporting roles, disregarding their advice on frontier warfare, and expected, even demanded, harsh discipline and free supplies. Southold militia came back with stories of being beaten and whipped for the slightest infraction. This disrespectful treatment created significant tensions that the returning Southolders brought with them and planted the seeds of hatred for the British. To make matters worse, England lost a lot of money in the war and tried to rebuild by proposing taxes that would overburden colonists, including the Stamp Act. In 1776, after the loss of the Battle of Long Island, the New York Provincial Congress sent word to the residents of Long Island that those loyal to the cause of independence should evacuate north to Connecticut as soon as possible. August 29, 1776, resolved that it be recommended to the inhabitants of Long Island to remove as many of their women, children, and slaves, and as much of their livestock and grain to the Main as they can, and that this convention will pay the expenses of removing same. Although the focus was on getting the elderly, women, and children out of harm's way, it also heavily emphasized removing provisions and livestock to Connecticut. The enslaved were mentioned because the British often coaxed the enslaved to fight for them with promises of their freedom. So this was a strategic military decision, an attempt to cut off British troops from much-needed supplies. Long Island towns, such as Southold, feeling unprotected and fearing the impending British occupation, were happy to comply. Estimates of 1/3 to 3/4 of Southold's population fled to Connecticut, bringing with them whatever food, livestock, and personal possessions the sloops they traveled on could carry. British forces occupied Southold town from 1776 to 1783. Both armies, seeking supplies, sought to draw them from Long Islanders. For a while, anarchy seemed to reign, as British, American, and bands of opportunistic thieves plundered homes, farms, and businesses, seeking food, wood for fires, and anything else they could carry away. Augustus Griffin of Oyster Ponds, now Orient, remembered as a child. They left their homes and farms to the mercy of the British, but alas, for their empty houses and fertile farms, the shrubbery, trees, and fences, what a picture! Dwellings with broken windows, hingeless doors, and dilapidated walls. Dissatisfaction with British rule continued to grow in Southold as it did across Long Island, as both Loyalists and Patriots felt the brunt of the cruel, marauding British troops and Hessian soldiers. But some still held out hope that the king would hear their pleas for relief from the ill treatment and burdens of taxes being levied upon them. Now that I have set the scene of what life was like here during the Revolution, I would like to introduce you Parker Wickham, representing the Loyalist side, and Jared Landon, representing the Patriot side. This is a moderated debate, so I will be asking the questions and maintaining decorum. We will now go back to the late 18th century. As tradition dictates, we will flip a coin to see who speaks first.
Tails.
Heads it is. Parker Wickham will go first. Major Wickham, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My grandfather, Joseph Wickham, was a tanner from Southampton, and he owned the house right next door to here, that which is now known as the Old House. His estate included a 160-acre tract of land which ran from the Old House out to the bay. It was known as Wickham's Neck. He also owned all of Robbins Island. My grandfather, passed it on to his son, and I inherited it from my father through entailments. It was a legal device in inheritance law which restricted the ownership of real property to a specific male line of descendants. The land could not be sold, subdivided, or gifted outside that lineage. It was a way of ensuring, or at least trying to ensure, that the property would remain intact and in the family for future generations. My estate also included an 800-acre tract of land in Riverhead, which I inherited from my mother, Abigail Parker Wickham. I have 3 sons, Joseph, Tommy, John Parker, and I have 3 daughters, Parnell, Sarah, and Helen. My wife is Mary Goldsmith Wickham, and I also have 7 servants, slaves, and black field hands. What else? My political career began in 1751 when I was appointed fence viewer and prizer of damages. I was then elected as overseer of the poor, and in 1763 I was named commissioner for Suffolk County. I approached the lieutenant governor of New York, and as then a justice and a judge of the justice of the peace, I asked to form a complete organized company of troopers for Southold, which is why I'm sometimes referred to as Major. Later, I was elected town assessor, and I was elected town supervisor 9 times, more than anyone up until that date.
Mr. Landon.
I too am a 3rd-generation North Forker. My grandfather, Nathan Landon, came here from Wales in 1668 to Southold, and my father inherited the homestead, which was made over to him by his brother Nathan. My father was a man of important public stature. He held the office of Justice of the Peace for 11 years before the Revolution. He was a judge for common pleas for the county, and he wielded strong influence in our courts and conventions. At home, he was a leader in all town matters, including holding the office of town supervisor. I attended Yale, and my first wife was Martha Hutchinson. She died, leaving me one son, Elijah, and two daughters, Mary and Bethia. I then married Deborah Reeve. She died, and God did not bless us with any children. I married my third wife, Christian Conklin. We had one son, Henry, who was also a prominent lawyer and leader in all town matters. I was a surrogate and county judge for about 20 years. I was a justice of the peace for over 30 years and a member of the assembly for 9 years. And as a member of the convention, I chose the presidential electors 4 times. I lived on my father's old homestead at Southold till after the Revolutionary War.
When General Washington lost the Battle of Long Island, an edict was issued by the New York Provincial Congress to evacuate to Connecticut, a Patriot stronghold. What did you think of the evacuation to Connecticut, and how did it affect you, Major Wickham?
As a government official, a vast landholder, and as a leader in this community, and as someone who was publicly and ardently loyal to the king and the rightful government of this land for 136 years, I myself found no reason to evacuate. And I feel that the evacuation itself was ill-advised. Had everyone just stayed where they were, we would have been living as we were before, in abundance. This was a clear military maneuver by the New York Provincial Congress to deprive His Majesty's fine troops of food and livestock. Had everyone just stayed, there would have been food and provisions for all.
Mr. Landon.
Well, my family and I helped organize the evacuation from September to October of 1776. My brother, Captain David Landon, on the sloop Polly, evacuated 237 Long Island residents and their effects to Connecticut. This was over 1/3 of Southold's total population and included my elderly father, Judge Samuel Landon, and his household slave, Zipporah, who took care of him and looked after him in his infirmity while he was in exile. During those 2 months, Captain Landon made 5 trips from Long Island and back to Guilford, Connecticut, bringing horses, cattle, sheep, hogs, and people household goods. I stayed behind and looked after my father's household and holdings of my own and those of family members that had fled to Connecticut. Conditions were harsh, both here in Connecticut. Within a few months of their arrival, an outbreak of smallpox raged among the refugees. Many died before winter. Joseph Halleck of Cutchogue lost 3 children. Many a dwelling waved the white flag of quarantine, and corpses were dragged on improvised sleds to their final resting place. Now, since the yearly farming cycle was disrupted by displacement, food quickly became scarce, and many became weaker and more vulnerable due to starvation. I was very concerned about my father, who was elderly, and I wrote him many letters that my brother, Captain David, delivered. But I was unable to write him when I was in the provost jail.
You both have a reputation for having a certain animosity for each other that has lived on for hundreds of years. How do you explain this, Major Wickham?
I am an important man in town governments and fiercely loyal to the king. Landon defies His Majesty at every opportunity. He and his family deserve to be punished. I try to keep an eye on how Landon defies His Majesty, and I notify the military authorities and let them know what he is doing.
Mr. Landon.
My problems with Parker Wickham started when he brought a suit against my father years before the Revolution. You know, judges and justices are reputable and supposedly reasonable men, and they should not find it necessary to resort to the Supreme Court to settle disputes among them. Well, my father lost, and I was forced to deliver the fine levied against him to New York City for him. After that, it was all downhill, with Wickham trying to thwart every effort for us separating from the crown. I'm sure I ended up suffering in His Majesty's Provost Jail because of Wickham. I wrote my father to Connecticut this day, and I believe, as to Parker Wickham, he must not live here. I do not think Southold can hold us both if peace comes among us.
What was life like under British occupation, Major Wickham?
Yes, things were difficult when the British moved in, but all good citizens know you have to follow the laws laid down by His Majesty and the wiser men in parliaments. In fact, the rebels ignoring these laws made things more difficult for us all. The British officers were fine gentlemen, and I invited them to dine at my table many a night.
Mr. Landon.
Well, in August of 1776, when Washington lost the Battle of Long Island, the entire colony of New York was thrown into political turmoil. The functioning of the old government had broken down, and the whole town was subject to martial law. The administration of justice was suspended. Almost all the rebels left at the sight of the British so they could better position themselves to fight from Connecticut. But for those who stayed, they were harassed and plundered of their property. The British Army compelled the inhabitants to do all kinds of personal services, to work on their forts, to go to their teams with their teams on foraging parties, and to transport their cannons, ammunition, and livestock from place to place as they changed their quarters. British officers inhabited the people's homes, especially those who had the best rooms. They took their horses, wagons, livestock, and whatever else they desired to gratify their wants and wishes. In short, if you lived in Suffolk County under British rule, you were perpetually exposed to the grossest insults and abuse.
Follow-up question. How did it affect you, Major Wickham?
Perhaps the British soldiers were not quite as polite as I represented them. Even though my loyalty was obvious to all, sometimes they would accuse me of working for the other side, and I would be subjected to their abuse. They took things that weren't theirs, and they would help themselves now and then, but I would excuse it as an unfortunate result of living in wartime.
Mr. Landon.
Well, I am in continual fear of my house being robbed and raided. And they have tried to break in the house, but we staved them off. The houses of my neighbors have been stripped. I let the British have a cow, but I do not intend to part with any more under any terms. The dirty Tories, they raid our fields regularly. Many of the lambs that are born in the spring are stolen by fall. I really have to keep diligent and keep an eye out. Just 4 miles west of here, yesterday the Tories stole 5 cattle. I send regular letters to my father. At times I use Captain David and sometimes Captain Horton, but I advise him to be careful who he uses to courier my letters, or if found out, I will be in great danger. I've often lamented in my letters that the war has left me feeling very lonesome as I have been separated from family and friends.
Can you speak to the issue of taxation, Major Wickham?
Although the taxes seem high, we must pay them to support the crown. They will use the money to support the fleet. The British Empire is the strongest in the world and essential for the colony's survival. They will use the money to support the fleet and the troops that protect us.
Can't you see they don't protect us? They have turned against us. Taxation without representation is tyranny. Taxation requires the consent of the governed.
We have virtual representation. The Parliament acts in the best interests of all British subjects.
Taxing a populace without elected representation is illegitimate.
Gentlemen, please, a little decorum.
Taxation and representation are linked, and it speaks to the broader conflict regarding self-determination and liberty. We sent good men from Southhold to fight in the French-Indian War. Men from Cutchogue, like Lieutenant Simeon Benjamin and Major Silas Horton, fought alongside the British to victory. And now the Crown is unfairly taxing us to pay for the lion's share of the war. We don't have any representation in Parliament and how these and any say-so in how these taxes are levied.
The Coercive Acts of 1774, also known as the Intolerable Acts, are a series of laws passed by the British Parliament in response to the Boston Tea Party and included the closing of the port of Boston to all trade until the East India Tea Company was repaid for what tea was destroyed in the harbor. They revoked the Massachusetts Colony's charter, replacing the elected council with an appointed one, and severely restricted town meetings and allowed royal office officials charged with capital offenses to be tried in Great Britain, preventing them from facing a jury of colonists. Please discuss how you feel about these acts, Major Wickham.
A response by Parliament and the Crown to such heinous acts as the destruction of private property of the East India Tea Company is to be expected. They are trying to take control of the situation, and a firm hand is necessary since they are trying to govern from such a distance. Our established order and stability must be maintained. The events at Boston Harbor just prove how we would devolve into chaos without His Majesty's guiding hand.
Mr. Landon.
These unwarranted British laws violate our rights as Englishmen. These laws are so detestable that they have generated immense sympathy among the colonists and led to the convening of the First Continental Congress in September of 1774 to coordinate a united response which included boycotts of British goods and formation of militias. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these acts galvanized 13 of the 19 colonies to stand in solidarity. The Quartering Act, well, that seemed to affect us most in Southhold, where the British troops took over many of the homes abandoned by their owners exiled to Connecticut. It also seems to make them think that they could steal our livestock with impunity. Almost every letter I wrote to my exiled father included an account of more sheep or cows stolen by the filthy Tories. In the beginning, they wrote promissory notes that they had no intention to make good on, and in the end, they just took what they wanted.
How do you feel about General Tryon asking people to sign the Oath of Allegiance to King George III, Major Wickham?
If I were asked to sign such an oath, I would comply immediately, but my behavior, demeanor, and comportment would show my loyalties to the king without question.
Mr. Landon.
November of 1778. The oath was offered to the inhabitants of Suffolk County for a second time. On each occasion, the oath was administered only to men aged 15 to their mid to late 80s. In Southhold, 716 men, or 79% of the town, took the oath of allegiance. But we Suffolk residents didn't have a real choice. Our loyalty wasn't voluntary. We weren't allowed to freely decide. They were forced. Just because thousands pledged allegiance to the British in 1778, it didn't mean they were loyalists. Far from it in some cases. I too was coerced into signing the oath, but I know my actions can attest that I was far from loyal to the king. In a letter, I advised my father to take the oath immediately upon his return. Otherwise, who knows what kind of horrors might befall him.
During the occupation, some in Southold were jailed by the British, and towards the end of the war, by the Patriots. Were you jailed, and if so, why? And what was your experience? Major Wickham.
I had often proclaimed, I will not raise my hand against my king. In my role as a government official, I denounced those I suspected of treason, causing some to be jailed. I must admit, it earned me considerable enmity among certain neighbors. Now, at the time, Eastern Long Island had many loyalists, and I enjoyed wide, though hardly universal, support in my efforts to protect citizens from what I regarded as a fringe minority breaking the laws. In December of '77, myself, Orange Webb, Major Hudson, and Matthew Wells were taken prisoner in a raid led by Captains Griffin and Hart in a ship captained by David Landon, Jared's brother. They came down from Connecticut in a planned raid to destroy lumber and building materials that were being used by the British to build a barracks in New York City. Now, as part of a surprise skirmish with His Majesty's ship the Swan off the coast of Cutchogue, some of the Swan's crew were taken prisoner along with me and fellow loyalists. I don't know why I was taken prisoner, since we were townspeople. Only Major Hudson had any connection to the military. But some of us had strong reputations as loyalists. So I was taken under supervision of the Commissary of Prisons up in Hartford, Connecticut. Of course, being captured and jailed was not a pleasant experience, but being a lawyer and a wealthy man, I was able to manipulate my freedoms to a certain degree, and I found myself on parole, which, while attending certain duties to family and clients, put me in the unfortunate position of having to violate my parole.
Mr. Landon.
Well, within a few days of Wickham being captured, while in Southold, I was arrested and sent to New York City and put in the provost jail. I'm not exactly sure why I was jailed, but my brother David was very active in his aid to the patriotic cause, and Parker Wickham, or Ellen Nathan Burtz, another known informer in Southold, told the British about me. They didn't need proof or a warrant or a trial to take away my liberty. When I heard of Wickham's arrest, I wrote to my father at this point in time that Wickham's influence is not great with the generals anymore. So my time in the provost jail was not good. We were forced to lay upon the dung and the filth of the cattle without any bedding or blankets. We were allowed each day only 6 ounces of pork and a pint of flour. And we were made to drink bilge water. We were refused soap and water and to bathe in and to wash our clothes, though they became much afflicted with vermin and lice. When rations were low for the army, they became lower for us, if we got any at all. We became easy prey to typhus, dysentery, and other diseases. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables made most of us get scurvy. Some officers would threaten to hang prisoners if they annoyed them. And they knocked over bowls of soup that were left outside the cell doors by charitable town folks. I directly blame Parker Wickham for many of my family's troubles, and in a letter to my father I wrote, "As to Parker Wickham, he should not live here. I don't think Southold will hold us both if peace comes among us."
Before the war, the towns formed associations. These were pledges to the patriotic cause, an agreement to restrict imports and exports, and not to consume certain goods produced by the British. What do you think of these associations?
You did not sign the association. In fact, you mocked it. You called it a folly.
The association became more than a pledge list, right? It became a vehicle for public branding. I was labeled and condemned behind my back. This pledge list went to the Provincial Congress in New York, where it was kept on a permanent file. The verdict had been reached, and I was found guilty, and there would be no opportunity afforded me to defend my actions, to defend my speech. History will condemn me without having heard me.
How has this conflict affected your family, Major Wickham?
Split my family up. My daughter, Parnell, she was regarded as a staunch patriot, and she married James Reeve, who served in the 3rd Regiment of the Minutemen in Suffolk County. My own brother, Thomas, a Yale graduate, and an important political figure in his own right, served in the conflict on behalf of the Patriots. The legal problems this caused me, and the problems in town, I think cost my dear wife Mary her life, as I have had to lay her to rest in the Cutchogue burying ground. And if, God forbid, I am exiled, I don't think I would survive the trip to England or to Nova Scotia.
Mr. Landon.
My family and I have been united in the Patriot cause, though it has cost us dearly. My brother David Landon captained many a ship for the Patriots, and his twin Thomas fought for the cause as well. The British soldiers have wreaked havoc on our houses and decimated our livestock. I've watched them destroy the Cutchogue Presbyterian Church. I have been imprisoned and forced to lie to pay bribes to regain my freedom. My father Samuel, a most honorable and respected judge, was exiled from Southold to Guildford for 7 years. It was extreme hardship for him, as conditions were very bad, food was scarce, and often his basic needs were not met. He was ill in his advancing years, and despite good care his servant Zipporah took of him, when his petition to return was finally granted, he returned in a coffin that John Payne had built for £1 4 shillings.
This question is for Major Wickham. In the autumn of 1779, the Act of Attainder was passed against you. Can you tell us what that was about?
The Act of Attainder is a little-known archaic law that English monarchs used to use to deprive nobles and their families of their property, sometimes their lives. Once attainted, the descendants of the nobles could no longer inherit land or income. It's being used now to punish Loyalists and British officers. Punish them for treason, resulting in the confiscation of property and banishments. You know, many of the charges that were laid against me, including the sale of wood, hay, and grain, or the receiving and entertaining of British officers, could have been laid against almost anyone who lived in this town at the time, including Jared Landon. What was said that was most damning to me was my refusal to sign the association and my public mockery of it. I railed against it as an act of folly. And from that day, the town over which I held sway turned against me completely. I was defeated by Daniel Osborne in the next town supervisor election, and I had particularly offended statesman and patriot Ezra Lamondu, who drafted and signed and passed a bill of attainder against me and exiled me from town.
As a follow-up question to Major Wickham, what became of you after the Act of Attainder was passed?
While Long Island remained under British control, I had little to fear. But at war's end, New York State was finally able to enforce its bill, and my property was appraised and sold at auction in the late summer 1784 by the Commissioner of Forfeiture. In November 88, my family brought me to New London, Connecticut, under an order of banishments. Normally, I would have been sent to Nova Scotia or England with other Loyalists, but my health was bad. And because of that, I was granted asylum in Connecticut. My son, Joseph, he found me lodging and people to take care of me. And when he left, that was the last I ever saw of him or any member of my family. I have been found guilty of treason. My entire estate, including Wickham's Neck and the house on it, all of Robbins Island, and a large tract of land in Riverhead was confiscated by the state of New York, guilty of treason. I have been attainted under the law. My civil liberties extinguished. I have no protections under the law. I have become a living non-entity, an outcast. And this was done by a legislative act, not by a trial. Judicial proceedings never took place. I did not know of the act until after it took place. There was no summons, no witnesses to testify against me in open court, no opportunity for me to speak, no judge, no trial, no jury.
And a question for Mr. Landon. Other than the raid that captured Major Wickham, the Patriot cause in Southold seems very bleak. Can you share a success that stands out in your mind?
Why, yes! In 1777, there was a raid that is now known as the Meigs Raid, where Colonel Returned Jonathan Meigs and 170 Patriots and 13 whaleboats, and they crossed the Long Island Sound. They landed in what is now known as Southold Town Beach. Portage to row across Hashemamet Pond and the Baconic Bay, they landed below Sag Harbor and surprised the British soldiers. They burned 12 sloops loaded with forage, grain, and rum. These boats were ready to travel to New York to supply the British Army there. And they did this without casualties or loss of life to any of the Patriots. And after completing these assaults, they took 90 prisoners, marched back to the whaleboats, rowed to Guilford, Connecticut, from whence they came. Word of this came to General Washington after a series of military losses. And it is said it lifted his spirits and it helped turn the tide of the war.
Do either of you have any regrets or second thoughts about the position you have taken, Major Wickham?
Where lies a man's duty? I have sworn an oath of allegiance to the crown, as every crown officer has done. An oath binds me to my given duty. Should I have just subscribed to this association and thrown my allegiance to Congress? Should I have joined in this general revolt? Even as I, a justice of the peace, am sworn to uphold the law, I'm now asked to usurp it? Parliamentary taxation, oppressive regulations, it is true. The blame falls heavily upon England's shoulders for the state of affairs. But we cannot throw off our obligations either. Can allegiance be broken at will? The law disregarded, the state insulted and trampled upon. Others seem free to do this with a free conscience, but I cannot, and nor can it be forced upon me. It is not the ideals of the gentlemen in Congress that I fear. It is the abandonment of our current government. And what comes in its place? Loss of liberty, oppression, persecution, bloodshed. What will be the cost of reconciliation? What new tyranny takes its place? Right now, the powers of this association seem limitless. How is a government constructed that keeps them in check? I flatter myself that I have acted consistently and conscientiously throughout my whole conduct, with a firm belief that there is a future existence. And I defy the state to name an instance wherein I have acted rigidly and defrauded or abused any member of it.
Mr. Landon.
I remain steadfast in my conviction of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I give no second thoughts of us breaking from a tyrannical king. I only regret that I had to play both sides against the middle so often in order to survive, to fight another day. I regret the loss of life of good men, but it was for a good cause. My family, my town have endured a great oppression under the British rule, and I regret no loss or casualty that they have incurred. I am steadfast and resolute in my cause, and I will lay down my life for my ideals and for my new country.
The confiscated land of Wickham's estate, which included the old house just next door, was quickly auctioned off, and the proceeds were used by the new government to pay down their war debts. Ironically, and more than likely deliberately, the person who purchased some of the Landon holdings, which included the old house, was Jared Landon. Landon and his family lived out their lives there, and his family continued to live there for several generations. Robbins Island went to Ezra Lamadou, an associate of George Washington and the lawyer who helped draft the Act of Attainder against Wickham. As the refugees came back from Connecticut, they were devastated to see the destruction caused by the British, including the destruction of the Cutchogue Presbyterian Church. Since there was very little money available after the war, Landon organized a lottery and used the proceeds to personally purchase the materials needed for the church's rebuilding, and he oversaw its construction. In addition, he spearheaded many initiatives to get the town back on track. Until they could return to the land and grow their crops, the lack of food and flax for linen clothing persisted. The only positive thing was that the fields which had been left fallow during the exile had replenished themselves, and the harvests that followed were plentiful. Landon remained on good terms with many of the members of Parker Wickham's family who supported the Patriot cause. When peace came, Joseph Wickham, Parker's brother, and Landon were partners in the brickyard on Robbins Island, and John Wickham gave his legal business to the man who had been at odds with his brother. 3 generations of Landons, Samuel, Jared, and Henry, were all influential men who served the public and are worthy of note. Jared's son, Judge Henry Landon, while living in the old house, donated the land on which this library, at the time a congregational church, was built. Samuel Landon's house, today known as the Thomas More House, is set up as a house museum available for tours as part of the Southold Museum complex on the main road and Maple Lane. After Parker Wickham's son settled him in New London, Connecticut, Parker never saw a member of his family again. He died intestate in 1785 and is buried in an obscure private family cemetery just over the border into Waterford. His wife Mary, who predeceased him by 2 years, lies in the Cutchogue Old Burying Ground. In 1789, Parker Wickham's oldest son, Joseph Jr., petitioned the Crown for war reparations, and British Claims Board awarded him £2,800, although he had vast holdings in Cutchogue and Riverhead. Robbins Island was deemed the most valuable piece of his estate. Parker Wickham's nephew, John Wickham, was an ensign in the British Army and went to Nova Scotia after the war with the fleeing and exiled British troops. But via a trip to Europe, he returned to the United States and settled in Richmond, Virginia, where he had an extremely successful law practice, even representing Aaron Burr in his treason trial. His house is now part of the Valentine Museum complex and is called the Wickham House. In 1986, 200 years after the Act of Attainder was passed, a book was written by Dwight Holbrook called The Wickham Claim, examining the legitimacy and legality of the Act. The issues of New York State's apparent violation of Parker Wickham's rights became known as the Wickham Claim. The litigation, which lasted almost 4 years, was defeated in the U.S. District Court by Judge Wexler, who ruled that too much time had elapsed for action on the claim. The decision was appealed, but ultimately stood. At the center of all this controversy and history is the Old House. Built in the 17th century, it still stands today and is a museum where docents tell this story and talk to visitors about the unusual late medieval design and show them the interior, which has been interpreted to look as it would have looked when the house was first built. A blown-up copy of the 1784 Confiscation and Forfeiture Act of the Old House and the land of Parker Wickham as a result of the Act of Attainder hangs on the wall. The museum is open for tours from June to September, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 1 to 4. Thank you. Now, before we go into the reception, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
It's been said that among people living in occupied territories, 30% were loyalists, 30% were patriots, and 30% didn't care less. Comments, gentlemen?
Well, Stu and I discussed this, and what would we be if this happened in this day and age? And I think, as a 20-year-old man, I might have been a patriot for the cause, and I think now as a 60-plus-year-old man, I don't know. You know, it all depends on where your family stood, what your position was. It's a very tough thing, a very tough decision a lot of people have to make.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's possible. We don't know. Possible that maybe it was more like 10 loyalists, 10 patriots, and the rest were indifferent. Please let this all go away. We were discussing it before, and I told the story of a discussion I had with my son. This is maybe 15 years ago when the Turn came out on the show about the revolution. And I said to him, Danny, if we were living there, there's no doubt we'd be loyalists. And he said, What are you, crazy? We'd be patriots. We'd fight. And I said, Danny, imagine you come into my house one night and you say, hey, Dad, we're really upset about this taxation without representation thing, so we're going to go out and start killing a lot of people. We're going to start by killing the cops. You want to come? I said, are you out of your mind? Get on the house, plow some fields, help your mother with the dishes, stop it. But he had the last word. He said, okay, Dad, suppose you don't come back as a 70-year-old crotchety man. Suppose you come back, this isn't just this thought experiment, you come back as a 20-year-old kid. Yeah, maybe he had me there. Anyway.
Yes.
Question. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was living in Connecticut, and he was a Loyalist. And he went to Nova Scotia. Why was it Nova Scotia? What was the thing?
Because that was English territory. So it was either Nova Scotia or back to England. Yeah, anyone? Yes.
Yeah, I think some went to the Caribbean also, so people went to different colonized areas. I think this has been wonderful, and I think it's worth people keeping in mind the dynamic in our history when we look at what happens in places like Cuba or Vietnam, why every revolution is partially a civil war, and the people who lose it have certain values, and people who win it have certain values. And our problem in the 21st century is finding the way of understanding and relating to people from that experience.
Yes, I think if you watched Ken Burns' documentary, he emphasized the fact that it was actually a civil war. Yes.
Jared, what happened to your slaves?
I gave them their freedom.
Actually, Jared did manumit one of his slaves, Keturah, and the story of that is in the old house, and we tell it a more complete story about it on our blog that's attached to our website. However, although Keturah was manumitted or freed, her mother, Zipporah, was not, and that was probably a deliberate act to kind of keep Keturah working for the Landon family. Landon had an uncle who was a lawyer, and he was known to be very kind of manipulative and crafty in that way, and he was the one that worded the manumission of Keturah. So yeah, they were freeing slaves, but and then eventually slavery became illegal in New York in the 1820s. Anyone else? Okay, so
We're going to have a picture of them shaking hands.
I think maybe a picture of them shaking fists might be more appropriate.
Actually, Mark, if you would indulge me, I have a question. Sorry.
You're in trouble.
Yeah, he's the historian. I'm just an actor. Mark, since the Wickhams lost everything, how is it that Tom Wickham is still here, a descendant of that family, and he's still here and he's still farming?
Well, you actually answered that question yourself. Tom, the Wickhams, his daughter Parnell, she was here as a patriot. Many of the Wickhams were patriots, and they stayed here. So their descendants are the ones that were actually, hanging around here still to this day. Any Wickhams in the audience?
Yeah.
Okay.
My father-in-law, I'm not a direct Wickham, I'm a married-in one.
Okay.
But my father-in-law, John, always very proudly said, I will not lift my hand against my king. And he believed strongly in that whole thing. He felt that he should still own Provençal.
Well, one of the points I was trying to make too was that John Wickham, who actually fought on the Loyalist side, he kind of did a detour on his way to Europe and came back here to America. So although he was exiled and technically should not have returned, he did return. And he became very successful here, so much so that he now has a very nice museum named after him in Richmond, Virginia. So there were people coming back in many different ways. I'm sure they came back from Connecticut. If they could, they came back on their way to being exiled. And that's one of the reasons why I put that little story in, was so that you would be an example of, why there are still Wickhams around. And a lot of them, too. There are a lot of them.
We're glad they are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So please enjoy the reception.
Yeah, one more.
Oh, I'm sorry.